In the big picture, it seems obvious to me that people involved with evacuation from natural disasters could be traumatized by that experience. But I want to break that down a little bit and understand what evacuation trauma really means, at least according to how I see it. I think we've been desensitized a little bit to the word trauma. It's almost become therapy speak in a way, where so many things have been put into that bucket. But two things are true here. One is that trauma is objectively real, trauma is real. The second thing is that the experience of trauma can be highly subjective. I don't get to decide for anybody else what is or isn't traumatic. And just to talk a little bit about the typical person's expected response in situations like evacuation due to natural disasters, evacuation can trigger a wide range of emotional responses. People will very likely experience stress, grief, worry. These are entirely normal reactions to an abnormal situation. So it's important that we understand that baseline so we don't overpathologize every negative experience or bad feeling. This also means that not everyone who experiences evacuation will necessarily develop a severe mental health issue. Most people will actually readjust and rebuild just fine. However, some don't, at least not as easily. And it's important to understand that too, so we don't forget about all of those people who are disproportionately affected once everyone else seems to have moved on. So let's talk a little bit about who might be disproportionately affected. Why does it happen to them rather than someone else? And maybe what are some of the things that they can do to deal with that along the way? There's a few factors which can contribute to somebody's individual vulnerability. Things like pre existing mental health conditions. Now, that's actually a really big one. And it's also very common, by the way. Most people will deal with a mental health problem or illness at some point in their life. But there's also factors like the severity of the disaster, the personal resilience of the individual themselves, and the level of social supports that are available. So, if a disaster happens in an underserved, vulnerable community, those people are at a higher risk of long term trauma. Now, quite a lot of research has actually looked at the mental health impacts of evacuation, including the Fort McMurray fires back in 2016, which is, I think, of particular relevance here in Canada now during our worst wildfire season ever. Now, based on the data that came out of that research, I think it's reasonable to predict now that a significant number of people will very likely develop symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder, not to mention anxiety and depression, more than would have had there been no natural disaster or evacuation at all. So we know that there's a correlation there. We also know that the symptoms of these sorts of disorders can persist for months or even years after the evacuation. Now, given that we know that these issues are coming, like I said, there's not a small amount of research on this, there's a whole lot. Given that fact, I think it's absolutely essential that we prioritize mental health supports and resources targeted specifically toward the evacuees. There is absolutely no reason to not prepare for this emotional fallout now. Now, given that this is still a very active situation, there are still fires burning, and there still are people who haven't yet been able to go home. So I want to talk a little bit about the timeline here, how evacuation trauma plays out over time. I think of trauma in sort of three acts. There's the before and everything you bring to the table, the during or the acute phase of the trauma, and then the aftermath of it. So before the evacuation, we consider things like emotional flexibility, your emotional flexibility. Are you able to adapt and respond quickly when things don't go as planned? Can you bend but not break? That's a key protective factor for to protect you from long-term trauma. Likewise, do you have the resources that you need in your community and in your home? Do you have the good social support networks that you need in advance of the disaster? The focus there is not only on living in a constant state of anticipatory anxiety. That's not what we're talking about. It's really rather about being prepared by identifying reasonable risks and having a plan. For example, if you're in an area that's prone to wildfires or floods or hurricanes or whatever the risk is, having a reasonable plan in advance of the disaster. Now, during the evacuation itself, should you be evacuated for whatever reason, wildfire or otherwise, the focus there is really on safety and stabilization. As best you can, are you able to slow down, to regulate your emotions, to remember to breathe? Are you able to focus on what you can control when everything around you it seems and probably is out of control? Also, during that time that you're away from home, should you be evacuated, you need to be able to allow for the uncertainty that you're no doubt going to feel in that kind of situation. Hard things are hard, and that's okay. We have to allow for that discomfort. Instead of trying to maladaptively cope with it or to run from it entirely. So, what can help with that is managing the things that you can. Things like your basic living arrangements and your expenses, but also helping out with other evacuees. Volunteerism can be a great way to not only stay present in yourself, but to give back to your community. So you don't just get lost in a catastrophic future, not just yet anyway. Then, after you return, if there were losses that you sustained personally or in your community, make space for those, grieve those. Recognize also that you're going to need some time to resettle after such an upset like this, that you can't possibly expect just to go back to the way things were without a period of readjustment. And that's okay. Now, at the same time, I think that this is where trauma, in my opinion, this is where trauma can have a certain stickiness to it. It's in this loss phase. Meanwhile, I've come to think of recovery as a radical act of letting go. You're letting go of that which you had no control over, letting go over the mistakes that you thought that you made, or the things that you thought you could have done differently. You're letting go of how you thought things would be, how you thought your future was supposed to be. That's, I think, the true essence of trauma recovery. Now, that's easier said than done, right? So, what can we actually do to help people let go, to help ourselves let go, and to move on from such horrific events? It's so easy, I think, to get stuck in that circular trap of anger, regret, bitterness. Those emotions are entirely valid, and they might actually even be accurate for a period of time. But I think eventually you have to come to a point where you ask yourself, does this help? Does this way of being still serve me? I think that zooming out to see that bigger picture or progression in your life, that can be helpful here. And recent evidence has confirmed the idea that storytelling is an effective intervention in trauma. Now, just one method rather that I'll mention here, because I was just reading about it just a few days ago, and the study that I was reading found positive results. It's known as written exposure therapy. Now, this is a very simple method that involves writing out everything that happened to you, your trauma experience. But what you're doing in that is giving your story a narrative. You're giving it a beginning, a middle, and an end, relatively speaking. It's never the end, of course. But this makes it make sense, at least in your own head, which is the only place that, in my opinion, really matters. Now, even if you don't know where you are in the process of trauma, of recovery, the journey, if you want to use that metaphor, even if you don't know how long you're going to be at any given phase or stage, at least the narrative of there being a process at all helps us to feel hope that there might be a future state of change. Now, before I go, I want to reflect a little bit, very briefly, on how I've found gratitude in loss. I think it's important to me to intentionally practice gratitude, to remind myself to do that as often as possible. And I'm grateful in thinking about this topic for this column about evacuation trauma. I'm so grateful that I've had so many of my own opportunities to share my own story and to give it shape. It makes it less of a sticky bramble to give your story order. Does it matter if that order is the order that anybody else wants it to be? Not really. I mean, I'm very open about the fact that I spent much of my teenage years accumulating psychiatric diagnoses. But my very first diagnosis was actually an adjustment disorder. I had a pathological resistance to change. I mean, it probably came, at least in part, from the fact that my mother packed our bags and moved out more than a dozen times throughout my childhood, taking me with her each and every time. And while that, of course, is entirely different from evacuating your home because of a wildfire or a flood or a hurricane or some other natural disaster, I think, though, that it has given me a lot of opportunity to reflect on what home means in the story that we tell ourselves about our own life. It reminds me that I own everything that has happened to me. And you do too. You can use everything that's happened to you as material. It's material to either build yourself a torture chamber, or you can use it to build a secure home in your own heart. such that wherever you go, there you are, at home. I'm so grateful that I feel at home in myself. I hope that for you too.